Today, we are going to get into a book that, and I'm not exaggerating here, has completely changed the game for how we think about getting older, about our health, and about medicine itself. We're diving deep into Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity by Dr. Peter Attia. And, let's just get this out of the way right up front. This is not just another diet book. It's not some new workout fad that you're going to try for a month and then forget about. No, this is something else entirely. It's a manifesto. It's a call to arms for a total revolution in how we, you and I, approach our own health. And it's a revolution born from two things. First, the intense, soul-crushing frustration of a brilliant surgeon who felt like he was losing a game he was supposed to be winning. And second, a deeply personal health crisis that forced him, this world-class doctor, to turn all of his obsessive genius-level research skills onto the one subject he had been totally neglecting, himself. So today we're going to unpack that entire journey. We'll look at his groundbreaking philosophy and the powerful, practical tools he gives us for not just tacking on a few extra years to your lifespan, but for radically, fundamentally improving your health span. That is, the quality of your life, your vitality, right up into the very end.
All right, so here's the plan. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the doctor's dilemma, where we'll see how a single recurring nightmare really exposed the massive flaw in his medical training. Then we get to a huge turning point in the patient becomes the subject, a moment when a really humbling personal crisis completely flipped his focus. From there, we'll break down a new medical philosophy, which is his revolutionary idea of medicine 3.0. After that, we get really practical with the longevity toolkit, and we'll look at this critical but so often ignored component he calls the unseen foundation, stability. And finally, we're going to land on what I think, and what he argues, is the most profound and important section of the entire book, really the beating heart of it all, the ultimate why, emotional health. So, let's get started.
The book kicks off with this incredibly haunting line. In the dream, I'm trying to catch the falling eggs. Just take a second and picture that. Imagine you're standing on a gritty city sidewalk, maybe in Baltimore, right where Attia was doing his surgical residency. And you look up, and from the sky, eggs are just plummeting down. You're holding this little basket, but you know right away it's completely, hopelessly useless for the job. So you start scrambling. You're sprinting left, lunging right, desperately trying to get under each one, trying to cushion its fall before it shatters on that hard, unforgiving pavement. But they just keep coming. It's a rainstorm of eggs, faster and faster. You save one, yes, but while you were doing that, 3 more just splattered on the ground. The feeling is, it's just pure, overwhelming helplessness. You're trapped in this frantic, futile game that you know, deep in your bones, you can never, ever win. This single, recurring nightmare, it's the master key to understanding the entire philosophy of Outlive. It is the perfect metaphor for a brilliant surgeon at the absolute peak of his profession, who is slowly, terrifyingly realizing his entire field of medicine was playing a game it was destined to lose. And that dream brings us right to the heart of his professional crisis, the doctor's dilemma. That image of the falling eggs, that wasn't just some random stress dream. It was his brain's nightly replay of his day job as a top cancer surgeon at one of the best hospitals in the world, Johns Hopkins. Think about it. He was at the absolute apex of the medical world. He was performing these incredibly complex, technically dazzling, heroic surgeries. We're talking about operations that lasted for hours and hours, removing tangled, difficult tumors, fighting with every single ounce of his skill and his years of training to save his patients. But day in and day out, he was getting smacked in the face by this brutal, soul-crushing reality. He was almost always too late. His patients, the eggs, were already in a terminal freefall by the time they landed on his operating table. He talks about this profound sense of futility that started to creep in. I mean, imagine spending 10, 12 hours in surgery, meticulously, painstakingly removing a pancreatic tumor, knowing with almost absolute certainty that despite this heroic effort, the statistics were just awful. The vast majority of these people, his patients, would be dead within 5 years. So he was catching the egg, yes, but it was already cracked. The shell was compromised, the insides were leaking out, the treatments were toxic, the recovery was brutal, and the end result was almost always the same. He started to ask himself this question that has to be absolutely terrifying for a doctor to even let into their mind. What are we really accomplishing here? He was a master craftsman,
But his craft was just managing the last few horrible chapters of a long, tragic story that had started decades before. That vague, creeping feeling of futility was finally slammed into focus by a single, searing memory from his time as a medical student. He was in the ER, and a woman, probably in her mid-30s, was rushed in, gasping for air. The whole trauma team swarms her, and Atiya's job was just to comfort her. So he knelt down by her side, he was holding her hand, asking her name, trying to be a calm presence in the chaos. And then, in a blink of an eye, her eyes just went blank. She was gone. The diagnosis was probably a massive pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in the lungs. And that event just haunted him, not just because of the tragedy of it, but because of the question that it ignited in his mind, a question that would define the rest of his life. What was happening in her body the day before she died? What about the week before, the decade before? He had just witnessed the final catastrophic event, the egg shattering on the pavement. And he realized that his entire career, as it was structured, was just about showing up after the fact. He decided right then that he had to dedicate his life to preventing that single moment, not by getting better at catching, but by figuring out how to stop the eggs from falling in the first place.
This whole realization led him to make this really important distinction between two types of mortality, what he calls fast death versus slow death. If you go back 100 years or so, life was precarious in a totally different way. The things that were most likely to kill you happened quickly and often violently. A terrible accident at the factory, a nasty infection like pneumonia that would just sweep through community, a difficult childbirth. Now, modern medicine, what he calls Medicine 2.0, has become absolutely, unbelievably miraculous at fighting fast death. But in solving that problem, our own success has uncovered a new enemy. Today, for most of us, the threat isn't fast death, it's slow death, the chronic diseases of aging. And these things, they don't just happen overnight. They are the final act of a play that begins silently decades before the curtain rises. So Atiya makes us look this question right in the eye. And honestly, it's maybe the single most important question you can ask for your own long-term health. If you manage to avoid accidents and live a relatively safe life, what is the most probable thing that will cause your death? It's kind of an uncomfortable thought, right? But he argues that ignoring it is a losing strategy. It's like driving a car towards a cliff and just deciding not to look at the map. Because the answer isn't some big mystery. The culprits are well known and they are the main villains in the story of Outlive. And here they are. Atiya gives them this appropriately epic, almost biblical name, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These 4 huge categories of disease, first, atherosclerotic diseases like heart attacks and strokes, second, cancer, third, neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and fourth, this whole cluster of problems around type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction. These 4 are responsible for the vast majority of deaths in the developed world. They are the end game of slow death. But here's the critical insight. These are not 4 separate enemies you fight one at a time. No, they are deeply interconnected. They're like cousins who all grew up in the same dysfunctional household. They often share the same biological root causes. A problem like insulin resistance, for example, dramatically increases your risk for all of the others. So Atiya's core argument is this. You can't wait for one of the horsemen to show up at your door. You have to wage a proactive, strategic war against all 4 of them at the same time, starting long before they ever get a name or a diagnosis. So this professional crisis, this feeling of futility, actually led Atiya to leave clinical medicine for a while. He was frustrated, he was disillusioned, but it turns out medicine wasn't quite done with him. And this brings us to the second act of his journey, a deeply personal, incredibly humbling story where this brilliant doctor is forced to become his own most difficult and confounding patient. The quest is about to get very personal. The story is one of those things that's both hilarious and just makes you cringe. So Atiya, who is a man completely obsessed with pushing his physical limits, had just pulled off this enormous athletic feat. He swam 21 miles across the open ocean from Los Angeles to Catalina Island. It took him almost 14 grueling hours in cold, choppy water. He finally stumbles onto the beach, totally triumphant, completely exhausted, and immediately celebrates with a cheeseburger and a big Coke. And his wife, Jill, she looks at him lovingly and says something like, "That's great, honey. Maybe now you can work on being a little less not thin." Ugh, not thin, Peter. It was meant to be a gentle, loving joke, but for him, it landed like a punch to the gut. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to admit, he knew she was right.
Now, this is where the story gets really fascinating. How on earth can an elite endurance athlete, someone who's physically capable of swimming for 14 hours straight, be, well, pudgy? That question just burrowed into his hyper-analytical brain like a parasite. So he did what he does best. He applied his insane research skills to himself. He ran every blood test you can imagine, every biomarker analysis possible. And the results? They weren't just bad. They were absolutely horrifying. Peter Attia, the super athlete, was severely insulin resistant. He was on the metabolic superhighway to developing type 2 diabetes. His inflammation markers were off the charts. His testosterone was in the bottom 5th percentile for his age group. By every single objective metabolic measurement, he was a total train wreck. This was his wake-up call, his blinding light moment. He had this terrifying flash of insight. As a surgeon, he had literally amputated the feet of diabetic patients who, 20 or 30 years before their surgery, had the exact same metabolic profile that he was looking at on his own lab report. His elite fitness was just a mask. It was a thin veneer of health that was hiding this catastrophic metabolic dumpster fire underneath. That personal crisis, that not thin Peter moment, became his true call to adventure. It yanked him back into medicine, but this time with a totally different mission. He had to become patient zero in his own obsessive experiment to deconstruct what actually drives chronic disease and then build a completely new model for longevity, right from the ground. So his professional frustration and this deeply personal health crisis, they finally merged. They forced him to create an entirely new framework for how we should all be thinking about our health and how we age. He basically argues that we're all running on an outdated piece of software, an old operating system, and it is way past time for a critical upgrade. This is Medicine 2.0. This is the system we all know. It's the standard of care. You feel sick, you go to the doctor, they run some tests, you get a diagnosis, and then you get a prescription or a procedure. And let's be fair, we have to give credit where credit is due. Medicine 2.0 is a modern miracle at what it does best, which is fighting that fast death. If you get in a serious car accident or you contract a life-threatening bacterial infection, you absolutely want the full power and might of Medicine 2.0 on your side. But Attia argues its fatal flaw is that it tries to apply that same reactive playbook to the slow, creeping, chronic diseases of aging. It waits for the tumor to be big enough to see on a scan. It waits for your artery to be 70% blocked before it raises a red flag. It waits for your blood sugar to cross some arbitrary diagnostic line that we drew in the sand. Essentially, it waits for the egg to be just a few feet from the pavement before it even thinks about trying to act. So here it is, the fundamental shift in thinking that he proposes. Let's break it down. Medicine 2.0 is reactive. Medicine 3.0 is proactive. Medicine 2.0 treats symptoms and diagnoses. It gives you a pill for your high blood pressure. Medicine 3.0, on the other hand, seeks to understand and reverse the underlying process that's causing the high blood pressure in the first place. Medicine 2.0 is largely one-size-fits-all, based on statistical averages of huge populations. Medicine 3.0 is obsessively personalized to your unique genetics, your biomarkers, your lifestyle, your risks. But here's the most important distinction, the one that changes everything. In Medicine 2.0, the patient is basically a passive passenger on a bus. You sit there and the doctor or the driver tells you what's wrong and where you're going. In Medicine 3.0, you are the driver. You're in the driver's seat. You are an informed, active, and empowered agent in your own health journey, with the doctor acting as your expert navigator.
If this is such a fantastic analogy for what a Medicine 3.0 doctor does, they're not the ship mechanic waiting back in the harbor for you to limp home with a giant gash on the side of your boat. No, they are the navigator, up in the crow's nest with a set of incredibly high-powered binoculars, and they are constantly scanning the horizon. They're looking for danger that's miles and miles away. They're using every tool they can get their hands on, advanced lipid panels that go way beyond standard cholesterol tests, continuous glucose monitors, genetic testing, whole-body MRI scans to spot the faint shadows of icebergs long before they become an immediate catastrophic threat. So the central question is no longer, what is your risk of having a heart attack in the next 10 years? The new question is, based on every single thing we know about you today, what trajectory are you on for the next 30, 40, or 50 years? And how do we start steering the ship, making tiny course corrections today? This timeline right here shows you exactly why that long-range view is so absolutely critical. Let's take a disease like atherosclerosis. That's the hardening of the arteries that leads to most heart attacks and strokes. That disease doesn't begin 5 years before you have the heart attack. It starts decades before, often silently in our 20s or 30s, with tiny, subtle changes happening in the walls of our arteries. But the standard risk assessment tools in Medicine 2.0, They only really look at a 5 or 10-year window into the future. By the time that Risk Calculator finally spits out a number that flags you as high risk, the disease process is already incredibly far along. The iceberg isn't on the horizon anymore. It's right in front of the ship. The goal of Medicine 3.0 is to get in a time machine and rewind that clock, to intervene way, way back on the left side of this timeline when the changes are still microscopic and the disease is still potentially reversible, not just something you have to manage for the rest of your life. Okay, so we've got the philosophy down. But a philosophy without a plan of action is really just a nice conversation. So how do we actually put Medicine 3.0 into practice? Well, this brings us to the Longivity Toolkit. And the most important rule here, the one Attia says over and over again like a mantra, is that you must have a clear strategy before you even begin to think about tactics. He uses the legendary 1974 Rumble in the Jungle boxing match as the perfect analogy for this. You had a 32-year-old Muhammad Ali going up against the terrifying, undefeated 25-year-old world champion George Foreman. Foreman was younger, he was stronger, and he hit like an absolute sledgehammer. Almost everyone on the planet believed Ali was going to be annihilated. A head-on fight, a tactical slugfest, would have been suicide for Ali. So he devised this brilliant, totally counterintuitive strategy, the rope-a-dope. For 7 straight rounds, Ali just leaned back against the ropes, covered his head, and let Foreman pound on him. He absorbed a truly brutal amount of punishment, letting Foreman completely exhaust himself by punching his arms, his shoulders, his body. The crowd was screaming. They thought Ali was finished. But then, in the 8th round, a visibly gassed Foreman had literally punched himself out, and Ali saw his moment, came off the ropes, and knocked him out cold. That right there is strategy before tactics. Ali's tactics, the specific punches he threw in that 8th round, they only worked because of his overarching 7-round strategy of absorbing punishment. So for longevity, our strategy is to build a body that is as resilient as possible to the inevitable decline of aging. The tactics are the specific things we do, the exercises, the foods we eat, the supplements we might take. But without that clear strategy, tactics are just a random collection of trendy workouts and fad diets. They're aimless. So the 2 central pillars of Attia's exercise strategy are, 1, building elite-level cardiorespiratory fitness, and 2, preserving strength for as long as we live. The goal isn't just to look good at the beach or to perform well in a race today. It's to build such a huge buffer of physical capacity that even when the inevitable decline of age chips away at us, we still remain highly functional and vibrant in our final decades. If you need any more convincing about the sheer power of cardiorespiratory fitness, this one data point should do it, and it is absolutely jaw-dropping. We all know that smoking is one of the worst things you can possibly do for your health, right? Being a current smoker increases your risk of dying from any cause, what we call all-cause mortality, by about 40% compared to a non-smoker. That's a massive risk. But now, look at fitness. If you compare someone in the bottom 25% of cardiovascular fitness for their age and sex to someone who's in the top 2.5%, the person with low fitness has a 400% higher risk of all-cause mortality. Let that sink in. That's a risk that is 10 times greater than the risk of smoking. You could argue that being unfit is the single greatest risk factor for an early death, and yet it's something that we have almost complete and total control over. So how do you actually set your training strategy? Attia gives us this brilliant and deeply personal framework he calls the centenarian decathlon. The idea is to stop obsessing about your 5K time next month and start thinking about your last decade of life. So you sit down and with vivid, concrete detail, you define the 10 physical tasks you want to be able to do with complete ease when you're in your 90s. Maybe one of them is being able to lift your great-grandchild into the air. Maybe it's hiking your favorite trail without help. Maybe it's something as simple but as crucial as being able to get up off the floor unassisted if you fall. These 10 things, they become your personal events. Then you just work backward from the future. To be able to do X at age 95, what do I need to be able to do at 85? And to do that, what do I need to do at 75? And therefore, what do I need to start training for today? This completely transforms exercise from a chore you have to do into a focused, meaningful training program for the most important competition of your life, the rest of your life.
Okay, so let's get into a specific tactic. A huge cornerstone of Attia's cardio strategy is something called Zone 2 training. Now, this isn't a sexy, high-intensity, crush-yourself kind of workout. It's actually the opposite. It's a low and slow, steady aerobic effort. The way to gauge it is, It's a pace where you could hold a conversation, but you'd really rather not. You're breathing a little too hard for comfortable chatting. The magic of Zone 2 is what it does on a cellular level. It specifically targets your mitochondria. Those are the tiny little power plants inside your cells. This type of training is the single best way to increase both the number of your mitochondria and the efficiency of each one. It trains them to become incredibly good at using fat for fuel, which improves your metabolic flexibility and directly fights insulin resistance. Atia recommends a solid dose of this at least 3 hours a week, maybe spread out over 4 45-minute sessions. It is the steady, unglamorous foundation upon which all of your higher intensity fitness is built.
But here's the thing. All the cardio fitness and all the strength in the world are completely useless if you're constantly getting injured and you can't train. And this brings us to what Atia considers the true unsung hero of physical longevity, the invisible scaffolding that supports everything else you do. This is the unseen foundation of stability. Here we go with another one of Atia's fantastic analogies. He says that most of us, even people who are really fit, have bodies that move like a streetcar. You know, a comfy family sedan. It's great for just cruising down the highway. But if you try to take a sharp corner at high speed, the suspension gets all sloppy, the body rolls and leans, and you feel like you're about to lose control. A Formula One race car, on the other hand, is incredibly stiff. Its suspension is engineered to handle immense forces with absolutely zero wasted motion. That stiffness is what allows it to perform at the highest level. And that's what we want for our bodies. Stability is the ability of our muscular system to subconsciously harness, slow down, and stop forces, preventing all the sloppy, compensatory movements that sooner or later inevitably lead to injury. And trust me, Atia learned this lesson the hard way. Despite being this elite athlete, he was constantly plagued by chronic injuries in his back, his hips, his shoulders. He finally went to see this brilliant movement specialist named Beth Lewis. She asked him to do something very simple. A bodyweight squat. Atia, who could deadlift over 400 pounds, thought this was just ridiculous. A bodyweight squat? Come on. But she filmed him doing it, and when she showed him the video, he was absolutely horrified. His hips were tilting all over the place, his lower back was rounding, his movement patterns were a complete disaster. It took him 9 full months of painstaking work, going back to the absolute basics of movement, just to learn how to do a simple squat correctly. It was this profoundly humbling lesson. Raw strength and fitness do not equal stability. So how do you build this stable race car body? The approach he recommends is rooted in principles from a field called dynamic neuromuscular stabilization, or DNS. The core idea is that we have to relearn the perfect innate movement patterns that we all had as babies. The way an infant naturally learns to roll over, to get on all fours, to crawl, to stand up. It's about reestablishing the correct sequence of how our muscles should fire. And a huge, huge part of this is relearning how to breathe properly. Not the shallow chest breathing that most of us do all day, but deep, 3-dimensional diaphragmatic breathing that creates something called intra-abdominal pressure. This pressure basically acts like a natural internal weightlifting belt. It creates a rigid, stable cylinder around your spine, protecting it from the inside out. This kind of breathing, he argues, is the absolute bedrock of all safe, powerful movement. So, we've covered exercise, nutrition, sleep, and this crucial idea of stability. We have the complete physical toolkit. But now we get to the part of the book that Atia himself says was the most difficult, the most painful, and ultimately the most important part of his entire journey. This is the true foundation of a life that's actually worth living longer. This is the ultimate why that has to be behind this whole quest for longevity. Our emotional health. This was not a quick fix. This wasn't some weekend seminar or a simple insight. It was a brutal, multi-year odyssey for him. It all started when his young son had a life-threatening medical crisis. Atia, the doctor, responded with this shocking clinical detachment that revealed to his wife and eventually to himself just how emotionally walled off he had become. This pushed him into his first real attempt at intensive therapy, where he began the agonizing process of confronting his deep-seated childhood trauma. But it wasn't enough. He later hit a complete rock bottom, where the immense pressures of his work and the added stress of the pandemic led to a total breakdown. Finally, in desperation, he checked himself into an intensive 3-week residential program where he finally had a profound, life-altering breakthrough. What Peter Audia discovered in this journey was that his entire life, his relentless obsessive drive, his pursuit of perfection, his incredible list of achievements was all a fortress. It was a giant wall he had built to keep out the trauma and the deep feelings of worthlessness from his childhood. He had this vicious inner critic, a voice in his head that constantly told him he was garbage, that he wasn't good enough, and his superhuman drive was just a desperate attempt to outrun that voice. He finally came to understand that emotional health is not a soft skill that's nice to work on if you have some spare time. No, it is a biological necessity. Chronic emotional distress, things like anger, fear, shame, that stuff translates directly into chronic inflammation, high cortisol levels, and poor sleep, which are all rocket fuel for the Four Horsemen. In therapy, he was given tools, many of them from a framework called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. He learned concepts like the window of tolerance. That's the zone where you can feel emotional distress without either completely shutting down or exploding in rage. And he realized his window was infinitesimally narrow, so he learned specific skills to widen that window. He learned how to practice mindfulness, and most importantly, he learned how to create a tiny, crucial gap between an emotional trigger, like one of his kids spilling a glass of milk, and his destructive knee-jerk reaction, which was often just uncontrollable rage. He learned how to pause. This quote from the therapist Terrence Real just perfectly captures the gravity of what Attia realized he had to do. His anger, his emotional detachment, his relentless perfectionism, it wasn't just his, it was a legacy. It was a wildfire that had been passed down through his family, from one generation to the next. And he recognized that all his work as a doctor, all his scientific knowledge, all his incredible physical feats would mean absolutely nothing if he just passed that same fire on to his own children. He realized that he had to be the one to stop its spread. He had to summon the unimaginable courage to stop running, turn around, and walk directly into the flames of his own past. And this, right here, is the soul of the book. This is the ultimate lesson. What is the point of optimizing your mitochondrial function and having perfect blood markers if you are miserable? If your relationships are a complete mess? If you are alienated from your family and, even worse, from your own self? A long life is not a blessing if that life is just filled with rage and despair and loneliness. All the physical work, the exercise, the nutrition, the stability training, that's all just building a strong, sturdy platform. But our emotional health, our relational health, that's what gives that life meaning and purpose. It provides the why. Why do you even want to live longer? For what purpose and for whom?
So let's just bring it all together. Outlive is so much more than a book. It's really a new operating manual for how to live. The big picture strategy is to shift your entire mindset from the reactive medicine 2.0 that we all grew up with to the proactive long-term thinking of medicine 3.0. The day-to-day tactics involve consistently working on the 4 pillars of physical health. That's exercise, nutrition, sleep, and that critical foundation of stability. But the true foundation, a bedrock, upon which everything else absolutely must be built, is the hard, necessary, and ongoing work of cultivating your emotional health. Because that is what ultimately allows you to define and then live for your purpose.
Dr. Adia has laid out the roadmap for us. He's given us the science, and he's given us the tools. He has shown us the path, but he can't walk it for us. The final, and by far the most important part of this whole journey is yours. The book and this explainer, it all ends by turning the question right back to you. The one question that has to fuel every single workout, every healthy choice you make, in every single moment of difficult self-reflection is this one. What is your why? Thanks for joining us.